Okay. And yeah, I was going to do something from Vayikra and from our Torah reading this week, and there is actually some interesting stuff in Parashat Tzav, but it's also obviously Pesach next week. So thought we would look back at the very rich and complicated parts that cover the book of Exodus, because there's a lot of Zohar on the book of Exodus and relatively little on the book of Leviticus. And so I pulled out just a little part that I actually haven't looked at before in much depth myself. So we're going to learn it together for the first time, which is starting with, hang on, that's the wrong one. We've got, all right, share screen. That should be bigger. Right, there we go. Can everyone see that? Yes. Hello, Lorraine.
Hello. Hi.
Lovely to see you. So this is jumping back to Exodus chapter 12, of course, the Pesach story as it is that we're sitting down to Seder in roughly a week's time, no pressure. And wanted to jump back here. You'll see partially because it's also a bit timely. But the starting off point, as usual, is a part of a quote of a verse which describes the final plague, the 10th plague that resulted in the death of the firstborn of Egypt. And it describes there, it happened in the middle of the night, right? This is the dark scene where the destroyer is coming through Egypt and the Israelites have painted their doors with blood and everyone is being killed. And in the morning they wake up, or actually in the middle of the night, they discover what's gone on. In the morning, the Israelites leave. Not clear of the timing, by the way, in terms of when the Israelites leave, but they end up at the sea probably the next day, also at night. So lots of the story actually happens at night. The entire scene at the sea in which they walk through the sea happens at night, right? The Prince of Egypt movie version happens during the day, but in the Torah happens at night. When they get to the other side, it's dawn. So most of the Pesach story happens in the dark, which is not something we usually appreciate. It's part of the reason we do Seder at night. And actually, Pesach during the day doesn't have any particular rituals. We don't do a daytime Seder. And it's something which they use as a jumping off point here in discussing some of these issues around Seder. So typical to the Zohar, we have a commentary on a verse combined with a story about some of the rabbis, combined with their tangents about 10 other things, combined with their interpretations of the Sfirot and other things that they're trying to apply to the text. So wonderfully messy, but I think we should just dive in and see where we get to and see what we can learn about this idea of it happened in the middle of the night. Someone fancy reading first about Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yosei? Robin, is that a volunteer? Yeah, okay.
Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yosei were traveling from Usha to Lida, and Rabbi Chia was riding on a donkey. Rabbi Yosei said, "Let us sit here and pray, for the time of Mincha has arrived. And we have learned one should always be careful about the prayer of Mincha." Why careful? Because that's the time when judgment impends and one must concentrate his mind. Rabbi Chia dismounted and they prayed.
Okay, just pause you there for a second, give us some context, right? In terms of where they're traveling, Usha was one of the cities that the early rabbinic movement was set up in central Israel. Lida, now known as Lod, is where the airport is in Israel. If you've ever flown into Ben Gurion Airport, it's in Lod. That's the city. So they were traveling, along what today is probably the Ayalon Highway, covered in protesters. And one of them on a donkey, one of them not. They pause for mincha because you can't really pray on the move. Well, you can, but it's not usual to. So they pause in order to pray mincha, the afternoon prayer. And there's a specific statement that you have to be careful about mincha. And that's because judgment, notice the capital J, impends. So judgment, capital J there is the sphira of Gevurah, right? One of the 10 sephirot is called Gevurah and is associated with judgment, discipline, sternness, restraint, all sorts of things that not always are negative, but are dangerous in some way. It's also associated with the kind of demonic and evil realm in a different sense when it's imbalanced. But there's a sense here of a connection between Gevurah, that's the sphere of judgment, and the time of Mincha. Now, the time of Mincha is usually sometime in kind of 3/4 of the way through the sunlight hours of the day. So could be now, actually, looking outside. You could probably still do mincha now. Could have been, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So there's a long time that you can do it. But it doesn't seem to us, obviously, that the mid-afternoon is the time of judgment. Obviously, we kind of being introduced by the fact that they started this with it happened in the middle of the night to think that we're talking about the middle of the night being a time of judgment. So you can see where they might be going with this and trying to think about what times of day are associated with what particular sefirot and how they kind of govern them. It's a bit like astrology, saying that, this planet has particular emphasis on this hour of the day. So they do that, but with the sefirot. Okay, let's carry on, Robin.
Rabbi Chia dismounted and they prayed. As they were traveling, the sun inclined to set. Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi Yose, "Why are you silent?" Rabbi Yose replied, "I was contemplating in my mind that the world endures only because of the leaders of the people. If the people's leaders are worthy, it is good for the people and good for the world. If they are unworthy, woe to the people, woe to the world." Rabbi Chia said, "Certainly so. How do we know? Because it is written, I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And I said, these have no masters. Let each one return to his home in peace."
Okay.
Chronicles.
So before we see their interpretation of it, although they explain, right, they want to change how the verse is read. What's going on here? How do we jump from talking about times of day to this reflection about leadership? Does that make any sense?
Is it about
I mean, it's notable that a rabbi was quiet for even any period of time, right? The key mechanic of the story is one of the rabbis goes, why aren't you talking?
Yeah.
We're not sure how long had passed, but not long, not much time. If the sun is now setting and they just did mincha, it's like been an hour maybe. And he's prodding him. And he's been silently thinking during this time about leadership.
Yeah.
Doesn't immediately explain why. We can take a look at the footnotes here, by the way. The footnotes are fantastic in this edition. And here we can just click on it and it gives us some other sources that have a similar issue or discuss similar things. And it's going to give us a background for what this quote is from the Book of Chronicles. Prophet Micaiah recounts his vision to Achav and his ally before their battle against the Arameans. The Israelites had not yet gone out to battle. So it's a strange and unusual verse, one that many of us will not have looked at. So going back to the text here, it doesn't really seem to be connected at all, right, is the answer. Rabbis just kind of sometimes go, I was thinking about this thing. And Rabbi here rolls with it and says, okay, well, how do we know that this is true? By the way, the statement that the world only endures because we have good leaders, and if the leaders are bad, then it's bad for everyone, seems like something we can probably relate to. And his proof text for this is this quote from Chronicles, in which the prophet describes seeing Israel scattered upon the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And God said, these have no masters, let each one return to his home in peace. So this is obviously a kind of negative vision of the future. This happens before a battle that takes place in the Book of Chronicles. And because it happens before the battle, they reinterpret to say, it says let each one return, but it should say let each one remain to his home, should read in his home, for they were still in their abode. So they're just reinterpreting this verse, but the verse is a warning before going out to a battle that they imagine that after the battle, the Israelites are going to be leaderless, like sheep wandering around a hillside without anyone in charge. And this is a negative sign. This is a dark prophecy of being leaderless. So that's his proof text. Seems like quite a weak proof text, and he undermines his own proof text by then saying, actually, shouldn't say this, it should say this instead. By the way, the fluidness with which rabbis look at the Hebrew Bible and go, oh yeah, it says that, but it should say this. This is definitely not biblical literalism here when we just go, that's wrong about that. It's supposed to be that word, which they do frequently, right? But despite the strangeness of this metaphor, they're going to keep it going, and they're going to be using it now for a while. So let's see where they go with it next from, however. Let's go a little bit further on into the Book of Chronicles.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, go on for a little bit. You're doing great.
However, we have learned as follows. If the head of the people is unworthy, the people are seized for his sin. How do we know? As is written, David said, "It is I who sinned, and these sheep, what have they done?" Samuel 24:17. David sinned and Israel suffered. And if the leader is seized for his sin, the people are saved, since judgment does not befall them. For so it is written, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said, "They have no masters." That is, if these are no longer the people's leaders, then from this way, each one will return to his home in peace, all being saved if their leaders are seized. Even Jehoshaphat was ordained to be punished because he had joined Ahab. Were it not for that cry, as is written, and Jehoshaphat cried out, Chronicles 18:31.
So they're playing with this verse, right? Just to remind ourselves of the verse that's there above. It states pretty clearly, right? I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills like sheep without a shepherd, and God said, "These have no masters, let them return to their home in peace." Now, we first interpreted that to be a negative prophecy about after the battle, it's going to be there's no leaders and everything's going to be horrible. But they're now adding a nuance to this whole idea of leadership and what it looks like. Because they're now explaining, well, yes, it's bad to have bad leaders, but that's partially because bad leaders end up causing suffering to their people. And they use the example of King David, right? That King David sinned and Israel suffered. That's the example they give. But there's a way to get out of it. How do you get out of it? If you have a bad leader, what are you supposed to do?
Hope that he seized.
Maybe.
He pays for his sins, or she pays for her sins.
Yeah.
Support the leader, I guess.
I don't know. They use this word a couple times here. Doing some seizing. Right? So yes, that's very generous, very generous reading of it, Renata, that actually they're meant to kind of support the leader. But I think there's actually a very violent implication here to some degree, which is that since it's the case that when the leader sins, the people suffer, if the leader is bad, the people need to seize him and remove him. And yes, it uses exclusively male language. Sorry about that. And how do they prove this idea that actually you should rise up and seize a bad leader before it causes suffering to the people? They use the same verse. So they read the verse differently. Now they read it, "These have no masters," those who seized their leaders and got rid of them. And so each one will return home in peace. So they take the same verse and read it differently, now suggesting that the verse should be seen as a prophecy of what to do if you're stuck with a bad leader, which is to seize him, get rid of him, and as a result, everyone will be able to go home in peace. I can see David smirking as we're thinking about contemporary Israel and the disaster going on right now. This is part of the reason that I connected with this passage, looking at it today, is because, it is a question. What do you do? Ancient Israel had many bad kings. Achav was one of them. He was one of the worst, right? Who's referenced in this story. And David, who was a very good king, nonetheless made a lot of mistakes. So you have a sense in which there's a real struggle to know the relationship between a leader and their people. But there is a sense that sometimes people suffer because their leader is bad, which I think we can probably relate to, right? The Russian people are suffering, perhaps we might imagine now, restricted from access to the world and restricted from all sorts of things because everyone's angry at Putin. It's not their fault, but they suffer nonetheless because of who their leader is.
Just
oh, hi Lee.
Oh, hello. Just thinking, when is like a problematic leader ever deposed without there immediately being another leader to supplant them?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that this is quite hard. This kind of fantasy here, these have no masters, and so each one will return to his home in peace. right? That's reading it in almost a kind of anarchic way, that if you rise up and seize your leader, then, you're not going to suffer as a result. But you're right. The reality is usually when one leader is deposed, another one takes their place. Now, maybe they're a better one. Hopefully they're a better one. This text and this idea invests a lot of significance in the leader of a people. Now, notably, it doesn't use the language of king or prophet or whatever. It's just using broadly the idea of leadership, because the Israelite nation has had many different leaders over its history. First, Moses as a prophet, and then priests in different settings, and then kings in different settings, and then priests again, and then rabbis, and then prime ministers, and whoever else, right? All sorts of people who serve in that role of leadership. Now, we're still having in our mind, what does this have to do with, and it happened at midnight, which is our starting point, which they're going to partially come back to, but they don't actually get all the way there. But meantime, right, as we remember, we started with, and it happened with midnight. First part of the passage begins with, it was mincha time, and then they did mincha, and then it started to get dark, sunset time, roughly around what time it is right now, looking outside, and they have this whole discussion about leadership. And now, as we carry on, they start traveling, and it gets darker, night, dusk, right? Absolutely fantastic language. I believe the note here talks about the language in Aramaic, which is fabulous, right? Dusked, ramash, which is evidently a Zoharic verb based on ramsha, or evening. Right, so they made up a verb of, and it eveninged, which is fabulous, absolutely fabulous. The Zohar loves making up new words, and Denny Matt is really good about pointing them out when it does. Okay, with us so far, as it's getting dark for these two rabbis, and they're debating the merits of deposing leaders, as it's getting dark for us, and we might be doing the same. So let's carry on from as they were traveling. Anyone else fancy reading? Thank you, Robin, who read so far.
I'm happy to read. No one else is. Yeah.
Take it away, Renana.
As they were traveling, night dusked. They said, "What should we do? If we go on, night is darkening. If we stay, it is scary." They turned off the road and sat beneath a tree, sitting and discussing words of Torah and not sleeping.
Right, so they're afraid to keep going. They're afraid to stay. Sorry to interrupt. Right, and partially that's because you have to understand we're talking about the 2nd century. The reality of traveling on the road is very dangerous. There's highway robbers and all sorts of things. You need to get to an inn if you want to sleep safely, or at least somewhere way off the road that you can camp. They end up, as it's getting dark, they were so absorbed having this debate about leadership, they kind of forgot what time it was. They end up kind of stuck. And so they end up sitting up all night, watching what's going on, making sure they're safe. And of course, that leads us to the key moment that we began with, the question of what happens at midnight. Right, let's carry on.
At midnight, they saw a doe passing in front of them, crying loudly. Rabbi Hia and Rabbi Yosef got up, trembling. They heard a voice proclaiming, "Those awake, arise. Those asleep, awake." Words prepare to meet your Lord, for a voice has issued, writing the doe above and below, as it's written. The voice of God causes dust to calve and strips forests bare. Psalms 29:9. Look, your Lord is going out to the Garden of Eden to delight with the righteous. Rabbi Hia and Rabbi Yos sat down. Rabbi Hia said, "Now it is precisely midnight. Happy is our share that we were privileged to hear this."
Okay, I'll pause you there for a second, Renana. So what happened at midnight?
They heard a voice.
Still.
They heard a voice.
They heard a voice, yeah? And they saw something remarkable. What did they see?
A doe passing in front of them.
Right. Why is that weird?
They sleep at night, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. As far as I'm aware, deer are not nocturnal creatures. Could be wrong. Not by no means an expert in deer, but I think it's unusual if you were sitting in the middle of the night that you would see a doe passing in front of you. Now, a doe is a very significant symbol. for the Zohar. The doe is the most common symbol, animal symbol of the Shekhinah, right? The feminine presence of God. Many times is represented as a doe. A doe, a deer, a female deer. Now, it probably isn't actually a deer they're talking about. Notably, the word doe, as it's translated here, is probably a translation of a Hebrew word that implies a more local species that we might call an antelope or a gazelle or something related. So, it's not a muntjac walking around ancient Israel, but something related, similar kind of animal, and a female one in particular. And that is a very common symbol for the Shekhinah. She is often represented as a doe, which makes more sense as to why they get so scared, right? So at exactly midnight, they see a doe passing in front of them and crying, right? So the doe is crying, and then they hear a divine voice coming out of the doe, it seems, or just happening at the same time. Not clear, but clearly this is a supernatural encounter with some divine presence in the form of a doe, saying, those who are awake, get up, and those who are asleep, wake up. Worlds, prepare to meet your Lord, right? Incredible language, plural worlds. Who's being talked to is the world itself, right? Nature is being asked to prepare to meet God, for a voice has issued, writhing the doe above and below, right? So again, an implication of the doe that they're seeing below is only a hint of the doe above, which is Shekhinah. And they have a proof text, as always. God always has a proof text because God's a rabbi and the rabbi's imagination. And the proof text is Psalm 29, which we sing on Friday night. The voice of God causes does to calve and strips forests bare. Right? Amazing imagery, by the way. It's a fabulous psalm in terms of thinking about nature. And the idea that God's voice actually kind of causes all these things, causes does to calve and strips forests bare. Now, the voice says, look, your Lord is going out to the Garden of Eden to delight with the righteous. Okay, so this is a well-established idea that at midnight, every night, God goes to visit the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden here is basically what we would call heaven in a Christian world, where all the souls of the righteous are. And at exactly midnight every night, God goes and pays a daily visit to the Garden of Eden and hangs out with all the righteous that are there. So the doe appearing to these two rabbis and the voice they hear and the fact that it's midnight are all connected for them in this kind of supernatural encounter with the divine in the world through nature. Weird, right?
Where is it a well-established idea? When you say it's a well-established idea, where?
So I bet if we click on this footnote,
Okay.
let's see. Yeah, according to the Zohar, at midnight, God delights in the souls of the righteous in the Garden of Eden. I mean, elsewhere in the Zohar. And those on earth who engage in Torah at that moment partake of the celestial joy. So this is the key part, is the Zohar encourages people to wake up at midnight and study Torah on the basis that if you do that down here, at the same time that God goes to visit the righteous in the Garden of Eden and study Torah with them, then you'll kind of, touch that supernatural energy in some way. So this is the basis of the tradition of waking up at midnight and adorning the Shekhinah with words of Torah in preparation for a unit with Tiferet. This parallels, interestingly, the midnight vigil common among Christian monks from early medieval times. Zohar doesn't mention that. This is Dan Hemat commenting in the footnote about the fact that this is something that probably was copied from Christian communities. Although it does hint haven't seen this, but evidently in volume 3, Rabbi Yehuda alludes the Christian practice, saying, I've seen something similar among the nations of the world, waking up at midnight. There is some basis in the Talmud, which is what's cited here, about waking up at midnight. Rabbi Shimon the Chassid said there was a harp suspended above King David's bed. As soon as midnight arrived, a north wind came and blew upon it, and it played by itself. He immediately arose and engaged in Torah until the break of dawn. So you have a tradition from the Talmud that King David woke up every night at midnight because of a magical harp which he hung over his bed, which woke him up. Great way to wake up, by the way, a magic harp with the wind blowing it. And studied Torah from midnight until dawn. And then there's a long list here of sources where this idea is established, right?
Okay.
Also a list of sources where the idea of Shekhinah as a doe are established, which is really helpful. Footnote, absolutely fabulous.
Do we know what exactly would constitute midnight in this context?
Ooh, excellent question. Love that question. So they don't count time the way that we count time. And when they talk about hours, they take the amount of sunlight in any given day and they divide it up into 12 portions. So in the summer, when there's more sunlight during the day, an hour might be what we call kind of 74 minutes. In the winter, when there's less sunlight, an hour could be as short as 34 minutes. So the hours are different every day in the rabbinic system. And what midnight actually means is halfway through the night. So the precise moment of midnight varies depending on how long the period of darkness is, but it's the halfway point of darkness. Yeah. Okay, which by the way, I think in most times is after what we call midnight, right? Maybe. I guess it depends when it gets dark. If it gets dark at 6 p.m. and the sun comes up at 6 p.m., then midnight is midnight. But if it's any other configuration, then midnight is a different time. Right now it gets dark at what? 7, and the sun comes up at 5, something. Maybe midnight is still midnight. Or later. Regardless. It's not too far away, but it's not exactly 12 p.m. by our clocks, or 12 a.m. They also didn't have clocks, right? They didn't use clocks the same way. They often use water clocks, which were useful for dividing up the hours in a more equitable sense. Also, I love the idea that in the winter, an hour is only 40 minutes. Because it feels like it, doesn't it? Okay. So, sorry.
The sun rose this morning about 6:50 and it got dark. Shabbat goes out now at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
So that's 10 to nearly 11 hours. So you would be looking at 5.5 hours. You'd be looking at 1:30.
There you go. Smashed it. So set your harp to tinkle with the wind at 1:30 this evening, David, as the Talmud describes your eponymous ancestor doing.
Okay.
You really got to be I know I'm not a morning person, but I'm not sure I'm a midnight person either. The idea of getting up at midnight, study Torah until dawn, you've got to be really committed. Interesting, by the way, the Zohar, they doesn't admit it as such, but Danny Matt points out this is probably also something that they're referencing because they see it a lot in the Christian monastic communities they live around, where there's a midnight vigil every night. Okay, remember, we still don't know. We still don't have an answer to, and it happened at midnight. That's still what we're trying to understand is in the Pesach story, what's the significance of and it happened at midnight? So we are here, and Renata, why don't you keep going?
Okay. Come and see the mystery of the matter. When the blessed Holy One appears above the garden, the whole garden gathers, inseparable from Eden. This Eden springs issue in numerous ways and paths, and the whole garden is called bundle of life, where the righteous delight in the word that is coming. At this moment, the blessed Holy One reveals himself to them.
Okay, so we should have read this before. Just a paragraph kind of explaining this fantastic notion of the Garden of Eden as an afterlife place, and there's all this water flowing, and it's picturesque in many ways. Everyone's relaxing, and every night when God shows up at midnight, everyone who's there gathers together. It's got to be an awful lot of people. They don't not too bothered about specifics, but it's a lovely idea. So there's a midnight class with God every night in the Garden of Eden. Okay, now before we saw Rabbi Chia talk, Rabbi Yossi was fairly quiet. He was the one who was being quiet. And now he returns us to our topic. Appreciate him for that, sort of. So let's carry on a bit further. Someone else want to read Rabbi Yossi?
Yeah, I can do.
Thank you, Jason.
Okay, so Rabbi Yossi said, "Many times I have asked about what is written. It happened in the middle of the night that God struck every firstborn in the land of Egypt. Why didn't this happen during the day? So that the miracle would be publicized? And why did all those weaklings behind the millstones and those little lambs die, rather than the commanders and mighty warriors, as happened with Sennacherib, as is written, an angel of God went out and struck down in the Assyrian camp. And we have learned that they were all kings, princes, royal officials and commanders. So the power of a single messenger of his was more manifest than here, where it should have been greater.
Okay, I think this is the best question I've ever seen a rabbi ask. What is the question he's asking?
Why did it happen in the middle of the night? Well, it should have happened during the day because of similar to Pirsum Nisa. You want to advertise the miracle, so you want everybody to see it.
Right. Okay, good. And in the context of the plagues, right? The whole point of the plagues is God to show off. So why make it happen in the middle of the night? And he diverges into a question I think all of us have asked when telling and reading the story, which is, and why did the wrong people die? Right? It specifically mentions just after this verse that the slaves behind the millstone, right? The slaves would get up really early in order to grind the flour on the millstone so that the wealthy people could have bread that morning. Why did they die? The firstborn were killed in the entirety of it. The slaves and the little lambs, probably a euphemism for children, right? Why did those people, the ones who died, rather than all of the commanders and mighty warriors? And you might say, well, that's not how God works. But he has another example, right? In the book of Kings, there's a battle against the Assyrians and the general Sennacherib. And there, this says, an angel of God went out and struck down the Assyrian camp. And we have a tradition, he says, that actually all the people who were struck down were the royal officials and the commanders and the soldiers. God didn't go out and kill babies, right? So if it was possible there, fighting the Assyrians in some battle in the Book of Kings, for God to only kill the powerful people and not everyone, then why here, where it should have been even more important, in the 10th plague, did everyone have to die? Which is, I think, a really critical question. I went to tell the story of Pesach to a school group recently at a local primary school just around the road, Fleetville Junior School. And one of the kids, after I told the story, raised her hand and said, well, why did God have to kill all the Egyptian children? Why couldn't God just kill Pharaoh? Completely legitimate question, right? So he had the same question, that child, that Rabbi Yossi had a very long time ago, troubled in the middle of the night after seeing a magic dough. Right, they're still in the middle of the night. Okay, so let's see what Rabbi Chia replies with. Jason?
He replied, "You have asked well, and I have heard nothing about this and will not speak. But look, we have been privileged to all this, and the way is paved before us. I have heard that Rabbi Shimon, son of Yohai, is purifying the streets of Tiberias. Let us go to him." They sat until day dawned. As light rose, they arose and went on. When they reached him, they found him sitting with a book of Agadah in his hand.
Okay, just pause you there. So Rabbi Chia doesn't have an answer, right? He quite fairly says, yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you, right? Unusual for rabbis to admit that. But he says, don't worry, we've got someone who can answer us. And of course, we know who that's going to be. The protagonist, the main character of the Zohar, Shimon bar Yochai, who is the chief teacher of the Zohar. At this time, evidently, he's over in Tiberias, in the Galil, purifying the streets. Don't know what that means. Okay, so now, after traveling from Usha to Lod, which is where they traveled overnight, they're now going to travel all day to get over to the Galil to Tveria to go ask Shimon bar Yochai this question. So clearly it's bugging them. Right now, both of them go, you know what? We don't really know the answer to this question. They really want to know. So they wait until dawn. They get on their donkey. They have one donkey between them. I don't know how that works. And they go to Tveria to find him. And they find him. And of course, as he's a holy rabbi, he's sitting there reading a book, right? But not just any book, a book of Agadah. Now, Agadah, of course, means legend or tales, but it particularly here means the explanations of the Torah, the midrashim that try and give some background to the Torah, which are not focused on halakha, meaning they're not focused on how we actually live our lives, but instead focused on teaching and explanation for what the Torah means, which is often called Agadah. And of course, it's very closely related. It is the same word, in fact, as what we use at the Pesach Seder, the Haggadah. So, what does he say? Let's hear his explanation. It's tricky.
Shall I carry on?
Yeah, go on.
He opened, saying, "All the nations are as nothingness before him. As nothing and emptiness are they reckoned by him." Since it says all the nations are ki ayin, as nothingness before him, why is it written as nothing and emptiness are they reckoned by him? Well, we have learned that in the opinion of all the nations of the world, their faith is ke ayin, like nothingness, unapprehended by those above or below, and they confront him with a faith of foolishness. However, as nothing and emptiness are they reckoned by him, like a whirlwind swirling in emptiness, as is written, all the inhabitants of earth are reckoned as nothing. Okay.
So first of all, what are they doing here? What is Shimon Bar Yochai doing? And second of all, how does this answer our question? Any sense of what's going on here? Very rabbi answer. You have a question, and the answer is, well, here's 12 verses I've kind of reinterpreted in a variety of ways. Well, he starts with a verse from Isaiah. All the nations are nothingness before him. Ka'ayin, as nothingness. And the question is, if it says that in the first part, why does the second part then have to say, as nothing and emptiness are they reckoned by him? Right? So the rabbis often ask, why does the Torah repeat itself? Because we assume it's meaningful and not just for poetry, which it probably is for Isaiah. And the explanation he gives is that just like the other nations of the world don't really have any real faith, their faith is like nothingness, meaning doesn't have any impact on the worlds above or below, that they're insignificant to the cosmic drama that the Zohar is obsessed with. So too, the people of the world, that is not Israelites, are also insignificant to God. God doesn't really care about them. Is this going to be an answer to our question? We might go, oh, I hope not. Yeah. Okay, so let's see how they respond. He's not done yet. Jason, you want to read this next chunk? It's a big one.
Sure, why not? He opened again, saying, Et hashamayim, the heavens, ve'et haaretz, and the earth. Et, right hand of the Blessed Holy One, ve'et is left hand. This teaches that the Blessed Holy One stretched out his right hand and created et hashamayim, the heavens. And he stretched out his left hand and created et haaretz, the earth. As is written, my own hand founded earth, and my right hand spread out heaven. I summoned them, they stand together. Shall I keep going?
Yeah, he's still talking. Rabbis.
What does this mean, they stand together? Would you imagine heaven and earth? Not so. Rather right and left, namely et ve'et. How do they stand together? Through Zot. This, the one who reigns at midnight, for et ve'et is included in Zot. And we have learned, it is written, et hakol, everything. He has made right in its time. Et, as we have said, hakol, everything, as is said, God blessed Abraham, bakol, with everything. And it has been taught that crown called Zot, blended of et ve'et, it rules at midnight in two aspects, compassion and judgment. Compassion for Israel and judgment for the other nations.
Okay, well done, first of all. I think if I gave this sermon on Shabbat, people would not have any idea what I was talking about. And indeed, it's like a puzzle, right? You've got to kind of work out what's going on. So first of all, he already opened one verse. They use that language. He opened a verse. He's now opening another verse, which is, of course, very famously the first verse of the Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And he's pointing out that it says ve'et haaretz, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Now, those who have done Hebrew grammar know that et is the definite object marker. So it signifies what is the definite object of the sentence. But it could be the sentence was written, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'haaretz. Right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is how we translate it. But in fact, the way that it's actually written is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but as two separate things, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So he's pointing out this is a bit strange. Why is it that there's two separate objects of the sentence? And he says, oh, it represents God's right hand and left hand, and how these are two different things. Right and left being usually symbolic of compassion and judgment. In many other senses, these are sfirot. And then he gets into math. Now, David, did you catch the math?
That adding the 6 to the to get to the 7, the et, and it becomes zot.
Right, very good. Okay. So we're playing with what's called gematria here, right? Which is that Hebrew letters are also numbers. So he's pointing out that if you zot, which is the Hebrew word for this in the feminine, so it's a demonstrative particle, and is often a stand-in. Anytime zot occurs, it's a stand-in for Shekhinah, right? This feminine is a stand-in for Shekhinah, can be seen mathematically as a combination of et, ve'et, as it is in the first verse in Genesis. And then they link it to Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. It says, et hakol, right? God made everything in its right time. And this is then connected to Abraham, Bakol, who had a secret daughter, according to the Midrash. We're not going to get into that. And the result is they see Shekhinah, Zot, as having both compassion and judgment, right and left, particularly at midnight. And of course, how does he explain it? What's his answer to the question of why is it that all of these Egyptians died? Is yes, Shekhinah does have compassion and judgment, but it's compassion for Israel and judgment for everyone else.
And at midnight.
Yes, at midnight in particular, right, is when the doe appears. And of course, this is a reference back to what they experienced the night before.
But is that partly answering the reason for the firstborn being struck down at night?
Yes, so in some way it's answering the question of why at night. And in some way it's answering the other question that he asked of why so unfair, right? Why is it that all these innocent people had to die? I don't know that's really answering either question, by the way. I find it to be an unsatisfactory and overly complicated bit of sophistry. But you can see kind of what the idea is behind it. Now, Rabbi Chia also isn't satisfied with this answer. So let's go a little bit further on and see his own dissatisfaction. Then we're going to try and go back and sum together all these different bits. Someone else want to read from Rabbi Chia when he now opens his own verse, right? So he's now kind of almost in a kind of rap battle. His teacher, Shimon Bar Yochai, opened these verses, and now Rabbi Chia is going to go, actually, I'm going to open my own verse, which is the verse we started with. Anyone fancy reading? Thank you, Jason. Not all at once, guys.
I'll carry on then. If you
All right, go on.
Rabbi here opened saying, would it please my master if I say a word for which we came? It is written, it happened in the middle of the night that God struck every firstborn in the land of Egypt. From what my master said, it follows that this coincides with that word. As for us, the way has been paved before us to come and pose this question to you. He opened saying, who is like God, our God, enthroned on high? Who is like God, our God, ascending to be enthroned, crowned with a holy supernal crown, sparkling radiance of crowns and diadems, looking far below, descending in his crowns, from crown to crown, from diadem to diadem, from radiance to radiance, from lamp, to gaze upon those above and below, as is written, God looks down from heaven upon humankind to see.
Okay, just pause you there for a second, just to see what's happening, right? Rabbi Chia, in the politest way possible, is saying that's a crap answer, right? Because first of all, he says, actually, can we talk about what we came here to ask you about? And then he says, by the way, I think you're wrong, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, about this idea that God doesn't actually care about other people, because look, there's this whole idea that God, although so high, is able to kind of go down and see everything. And look, there's this thing in Psalms that God looks down from heaven upon humankind, right? Specifically, it says humankind there. So he's really pushing against this idea that actually God only cares about the Israelites and not everyone else, or the Shekhinah is only focused on compassion for the Israelites and judgment for everyone else at midnight. It's clearly an unsatisfying answer. So they're trying to now come up with other answers. They're not going to succeed, by the way. But let's see a little bit more just of this last paragraph, and then we're going to try and go back.
Come and see. It is written, it happened ba'chatzi, in the half of the night, The verse should read Bahatzot, in the middle of the night, or Chachatzot, around the middle of, as Moses said. And if, as our colleagues have said, so that Pharaoh's astrologers would not say Moses is a liar, then the difficulty persists in three aspects, which even the Israelites would have noted.
Okay, so they're still unsatisfied, and they're still going to go on. They point out something with the language, which is that it actually says Bachatzi Halayla, which is not the usual way of referencing midnight. Usually it's Chatzot. And it could have said Bachatzot, which means at midnight, in the middle of the night, or Kechatzot, which means near midnight, roughly. But it says it's Bachatzi Halayla, which means in the half of the night. So there's a grammar problem they have with this. That still doesn't make sense. There's the issue still of the fact that it was the slaves and the children who were killed. And there's still a question of why in particular at midnight is this what happened? And they go on to try and understand, right? And ultimately they don't get an answer. Just to jump here and just I'll highlight this for a second, right? Your question exceeds a burden that an animal cannot bear. However, all is a supernal mystery among reapers of the field, capitalized, and all is rectified for the faithful prophet. So the answer is ultimately there is no answer. But I think if we kind of work our way back, we might be able to get some sense of what's going on here. So first of all, just to go back to where we started, and we covered a lot, right? It happened in the middle of the night. These two rabbis are discussing this verse, trying to understand Pesach, and in particular, trying to understand why the 10th plague happens at night and what that signifies. So the first thing that they talk about, just draw us back to that, because I think it's the most important in some way, is about this idea of leadership. And I don't think it's accidental that Rabbi Yossi was sitting here thinking and going, you know what? What came to mind in thinking about this was how important it is to have good leaders, right? Because if the leaders are bad, then the people suffer. Remember that? Right? And this idea that actually there's a responsibility of the people to address that. So I think if we really connect that with the whole picture here, we have a sense that what's being described is that the Egyptians did suffer innocently. There is no way of explaining it. You can explain it as a technicality that actually Shekhinah at midnight is only focused on judgment for non-Jews and compassion for Jews. You can explain it that at midnight, God is busy in the Garden of Eden and not paying attention to people down on earth. You can explain it in midnight, all of these other things are going on. But ultimately, the problem is not God, I think it's trying to tell us. The problem is Pharaoh. That because Pharaoh was so bad and so corrupt, and so unwilling to change, innocent people died. And what needed to happen was actually people needed to step up and get rid of Pharaoh first so that they could actually protect themselves from all the damage that this could cause. That's not usually how we read it. And indeed, it's not how the Zohar ends up connecting us to it. But it is something that I think is kind of embedded in the text here itself. And I just want to go back to that experience of these two rabbis at midnight, staying up. They're thinking about midnight. They're sitting at midnight. They see a doe in front of them. They're terrified. They're scared. They're not sure what that means. And there's a sense that something dramatic is happening, that God's voice causes all this severe change to nature and even in some sense damage to nature. And I think the reality is, and the Zohar seizes on it elsewhere to some extent, is that ultimately it's not really so much about God being responsible for these innocent deaths and all the violence that comes about. It's partially that the people didn't make any effort to get rid of Pharaoh, so the Zohar says. And it's also the fact that when God commits to let judgment reign, that judgment is indiscriminate, right? Like a voice that goes through and strips the forest bare, the judgment that comes out kind of hurts everyone equally. And it really actually connects quite well to the way that we treat this whole question, which is that we still feel sad and we still feel that suffering, even when we spill out our wine at Seder, right, as an acknowledgement of the fact that there is inherently an unfairness to the fact that the 10th plague happened the way it did at midnight, affecting everyone. It's an unanswerable question. And despite the many efforts of all of these quite clever rabbis to make some sense of it, the answer I think that still makes the most sense to me is the first one, which is recognizing the very human dimension of how important it is for people to take responsibility for having good leadership in their countries. So I think there's a good Pesach message there, perhaps. If you want freedom and liberation, you've got to make sure you are thinking about having good leaders in your society, because if you don't, they can cause a great deal of harm to your society. And if you want to protect yourself from all the ills that can come about through judgment, partially you have to protect everyone equally, because when judgment does come about, it affects everyone equally without discrimination. All humankind are equally affected by it. But I think part of the point is that it's a difficult question to ask, and one that the Zohar, for once, doesn't have an answer to. And ultimately, the conversation moved on to something else entirely because they can't really summon an answer to it. And that's part of Pesach too, is asking questions that ultimately don't have answers. So hopefully something to think about as we dip out our wine next week at our Seder, and think about the unfairness. And maybe, in fact, will last until midnight, which the Seder is meant to go until midnight. In which case you can perhaps look out your window and see a doe if you look at just the right time. In the meantime, wishing everyone a liberating and healthy and kosher Pesach. We won't be back for a bit, I suppose, because of the holidays. But I'll pop in the WhatsApp group as to what the next time we're on is. And maybe we'll try in person if it suits people. I know the timing might not be ideal, but maybe we can push it a bit later if it makes it easier. Cool.
Thank you for being our leader.
Well, hopefully you're not in trouble for it. If you need to seize me, I understand.
Thank you.